Let us now consider developing the HTML example that you created earlier. Currently, your form would look like this, and what we are hoping to do is to look at the various sections of the form and to apply CSS to those sections. So in looking at the form, we can identify the form itself. We could identify the heading. We could identify the input area for the text box and date box. We can look at a drop-down box for check boxes and radio buttons, a text area, and finally buttons. So our form looks like this at the moment, and then with a wee bit of CSS, hopefully then it will end up something along these lines here, where you can see that we have colored some of the input and we have spaced them out, etc. First thing we need to do is to create our CSS file. And you can see in this case here, what we've done is we have clicked on the CSS folder and then clicked on the new file and given that file CSS style.css. Remember to add the extension to all your files. And then go back into your HTML and within there define the link to that file. So there's the link that you need to put in. So if we go back into our HTML, you can see is that there is the folder for the CSS. We clicked on new file, we gave the file a name, and then we went in and we have given a link to that file. Currently this file sits empty. The next thing to do is we want to set up the form. Now, in setting the form, we must be aware of the elements of that form. And when we consider an element of the form, we also have to consider the spacing around the element, because this spacing consists of a number of layers and is defined according to this system called the CSS box model. And there are 3 layers to consider. The first layer is padding, then we have the border, and then we have the margin. And each layer can be set to a specific size using any of the measurements available. We're going to consider just the pixels. And then these layers are used to adjust the spacing and the layout of the elements on the page. So in our case, what we're going to do is we're going now to apply a system, if you like, in which the elements and the spacing are all considered by one measurement. And we're going to use the box sizing and the border box. So using this property implies that the total width or height of the element includes the layers that we mentioned earlier, padding and border. And these are then taken into consideration and therefore will provide a consistent layout for the elements being used. So let's now just go back into our model here, and then we will put in the box model. So we'll say asterisk, implying that we're going to use everything, and then into there we will then say box sizing, and we're going to use the box border. Next, we want to set up the font and color and the background of our web page, and to do that we shall add styling to the body of the form itself. So that's going to be inside the body element, And in there we will set up the font. We'll use this particular style of font. We'll set up a color. We'll set up some padding around the element. We'll set up a font size, and we'll set up a background color. So let's take the body and then we will apply it to our CSS. So we'll do body, and then we'll say the font family, and then we'll say it's the Guild Sans. And then we'll say the color, and we're going to say dark slate blue, and then we'll do the padding, and we'll set the padding as 36 pixels. We'll then say that the font size, and we'll say that's equal. Now to see the result of what we're doing, we will then have a look using the live server, and you can see there we have the font and the color and the spacing. So just narrow that down a bit and you can see it a wee bit better. So moving on, let's have a look now at a subheading using an ID tag. In order to specify a particular element in the HTML, we need to identify that element. And one way of doing that is by adding an ID attribute to the HTML. You remember that an ID uniquely identifies that particular element. So if we go back to our HTML, and you can see in here we have that the H5 has now been added an ID called minor title. So if you add that on, and then we can go to the CSS, and in the CSS we can then reference that particular ID. You remember it was called minor title. So and because it was an ID attribute in CSS, we refer to the ID as by a hash symbol. So then we say minor title. Open it up, and we'll simply just give it a color, and we'll say red. Go back, have a look then at the live server, and there you can see the effect of that particular feature. For the next part of it, we need to modify the HTML. And you can see in this case here, we're looking at the titles. And so where we have the vehicle insurance and then the GDC Insurance Limited, we want to reference this area here. And to do that, we're going to use a class attribute. So go back into your HTML and add in then the two class attributes. You can see I've already done that. So there's the class, which we're going to call company area, and then the next class, which we're going to call company title. And there's the start of it, the end of it, the start of it, and the end of it. And then if at any stage when you do modify your HTML, you can remember that you can go back and you can reformat your document to get them nice in line. So with that in mind now, we want then to go and we need to take these two areas here. And we're going to apply the CSS to them. So they were a class. That means then in CSS we use the period. And the first one we would call company area. And the next one was called company title. In each case, we're going to look at the width of this particular area. So for the company area, which is the larger of the two, we're saying that the maximum width was going to be 900 pixels. We'll allow the left and right margins to adjust themselves depending on its content, with a padding of 16 pixels around the various elements. And for the title, we will align the title to the center. We will have a yellow background, and again we'll have a padding. So let's go back to our code, and in the code then we will take the two particular areas and we will enter them in. So there I've entered them in, and if I now expand, you can now see that the area here, which we call the company area, and then inside that there we have then the company title. The next section then we're going to look at is all the input sections. In this task we're going to style the input boxes as indicated in the HTML. And there were three types of input boxes. There was a text box. You can see in this case here the type is equal to text. There was also a numeric box. Again, the type is equal to number. And there is a date box where the type is equal to date. And we're going to style these three types of boxes by using a single style. So the first thing to do is to identify our, using CSS, our input with the type. And there you can see the three types. Remember to have a comma to separate them. And then inside here we're going to set up the CSS for the border, for the font size, for the height, for the padding, and a background color. And that background color, as you can see, is a biscuit. So we'll set that out. And then inside we'll have a color of red. So that's so there's the three types all set out. And if we now have a look, we can see that we have the colored input boxes, and also then for the numeric one we've got an increase and a decrease. And then for the date, we can take whatever date you so wish to use. Add an additional style to the date. However, to do that there we have to be able to reference the date. So we'll go back into our HTML and we'll modify it so that we can identify precisely. So going back into the HTML, and here's our date feature here. So we'll go into the division and we'll say ID is equal to, and we'll say reg date. Now let's go back then to our CSS, and then the CSS, let's say hash reg date, and then we'll just give it a padding. Now the padding, when applied, what we have been doing is just giving it a single value. And what that single value has done is put a padding to the left, to the right, to the top and the bottom. But we can actually spell it out if we wanted to have different values. So we can put in 10 pixels for the left, 0 for the top, 18 pixels for the right, and 0 for the bottom. The effect of which is, if we looked over in here, as you can see we have a wee bit more spacing around the value inside here. Okay, so, and that's just what we've done. So I just said that the padding has 4 parts. Each part then provides a separation around the element: top, right, bottom, and left. So top, right, bottom, and left. Let's have a look now at the drop-down box. In this task, we're going to style this drop-down box for the engine capacity. And we identified this particular HTML by the ID engine CC. And you can see that you already had that as part of your HTML. So to allow the CSS to style this drop-down box, we'll pick up then on the engine CC. And since it was an ID, we will say it's a hash, followed then by the name given by its ID, engine size, and then inside there we will set the font size, the background color, and this time we're going to change the pointer, the cursor, to a pointer. We'll see that in a moment. We'll change the color to red and we'll give a certain padding around it. So let's go back into our code, and in our code here we will then add in the style for the engine CC. And if we have a look, you can see there's our engine CC, and if I drop down, now you can see they're all spelled out. So, making good progress so far. The next section that we're going to look at then is the checkboxes and the radio buttons. If we looked at our HTML, we can see is that we have as our input type here our radio, and also as our input type as a checkbox. These particular features are difficult normally to style, and to fully customize these elements we would probably use some JavaScript. However, to achieve a reasonable style, we're just going to add the following. So again, you'll notice that we've got our input feature shown with the type, a comma, because we're already going to apply to both types. And then here we have then an accent color rather than a color. We'll just modify it slightly. We'll have a width, we'll have a height, and again we'll have our pointer. So this is what we want to achieve. So let's go back into our CSS. Add the feature for our input boxes. And if we look over at our live server, if I click, you can see now I've got red showing up. And if we go down, just widen that out a wee bit so you can see the full line, I can click. So we have applied some CSS to that. The next task is to look at the text box. Now for the text box, we'll look at the width, the height, the padding, margins. We'll look at taking the border, looking at the border around the actual text box itself. We'll look at the color, we'll look at the font and the font style, and then we'll see whether we want to resize that box, and we'll say, in this case, no. So, and you'll notice also that it is a hash symbol and what that implies. So let's go to our CSS and we'll put in visually. You can see that down in here We have now a rounded corner around our text box. We have a font in there which is italic. We have a background color, and this is the text area. So you can see how it can nicely be shown. So the last part that we have in our form was the buttons at the end. So in here we have an input type for the submit. So if we have a look at the HTML, you can see down in here is that we have an input type for submit of the value, and when we looked at our form, you can see all we have at the moment is just looks like a button with the title submit details. So we're going to apply some style to this feature. So to achieve that, again we can say we'll use the style for an input attribute, but this time the input type is the submit. And there's all the features that we had mentioned previously, and immediately see that we have a nice rounded button in green with the white text. So we now have completed our form, and finally it looks something like it's shown on the screen here. And if we go and have a wee look using our live server, you can see all the particular features. So thank you for your attention, and I hope that you have gained something from our presentation this morning.